The soil was tired. That was the first thing Sadie Whitcomb noticed every morning when she knelt in her garden plot. The way the earth crumbled like old bread in her fingers, gray and lifeless, as though it had given everything it had to the family before her, and had nothing left for a woman who'd arrived too late. The carrots came up thin and bitter, the cabbages bolted before they ever formed a proper head, and the beans, planted with such hope in April, grew pale and spindly, reaching for a sun that seemed to shine brighter on every other patch in the county. She worked from first light until her back ached, hauling water from the well, turning the soil with a rusted spade, and reading the almanacs by lantern light until her eyes burned. But the ground would not answer. It was as if the land itself had decided she was not worth its trouble. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier. Tales of women who were laughed at, underestimated, and left for dead by the very people who would one day owe them everything. This is the story of Sadie Whitcomb and the winter that proved to a whole county that patience is not weakness, and that the smallest creatures often carry the greatest gifts. Picture her there in that gray spring, a young woman alone on the Nebraska plains, the nearest neighbor a mile east, and the nearest town a further too. She had come west on a small inheritance after her parents passed, hoping for a life where a woman answered to no one but the weather. She got the weather, certainly. What she had less of was money. Her savings had bought her the homestead, a two-room house with a stovepipe that whistled in the wind, a sagging barn, and a well that gave cold, sweet water. But after that, there was precious little left for seed, for lamp oil, for the flour and sugar that would see her through the coming winter. She owed Horace Bell, the grain dealer who held her note, for the seed and the stove parts he'd advanced her, and he reminded her of it with a little tip of his hat whenever their paths crossed, as though the gesture itself were a payment due. The loneliness was the worst of it. The silence of the house pressed in on her every evening, so total that she could hear her own heartbeat. No footsteps but her own. No voice but the one in her head, reading her grandmother's letters again and again. The old woman had pressed a worn seed pouch into Sadie's hands at the train platform before she left, and said something that Sadie carried with her like a stone in her pocket. Folks judge a creature by what it gives them today, but everything alive is giving something, child. You just have to be patient enough to see it. Then the train had pulled east, leaving Sadie alone on the plains with a quarter acre and her stubbornness. But patience is a hard virtue when your winter stores are thin and the garden keeps failing. The other women in North Platte were polite enough, but they kept their distance. A young widow by circumstance who'd never married, living alone, growing her own food. She was a curiosity, and curiosities are watched more than welcomed. She told herself she did not mind. She had her goat, her books, her grandmother's letters, and the long, quiet evenings when the wind died down and the stars came out so thick they seemed to hum. But the truth, which she admitted only to the dark, was that the loneliness sat on her chest some nights like a heavy quilt. She needed the garden to thrive. Without a harvest to sell and put up, she would not last another winter. And the thought of going back east, defeated and dependent, was worse than any cold. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. So she dug, and she waited, and she watched the tired earth, and she did not yet know what was about to roll up her rutted road in a slat-sided wagon. It was a Tuesday in late April when Jeb Coyle's wagon rattled to a stop at her gate. Stacked in the back were crates, and in the crates, pressed together against the cold, were rabbits, dozens of them, gray and brown and speckled, white noses working the air, bright eyes watching her like she was the answer to a question they'd been asking the whole long journey. "Bound for the butcher in Ogallala," Coyle said, spitting to the side. "Fella raised them, then up and died. Widow don't want them. Meat man will take the lot for near nothing." He squinted at her tired garden. "You want a couple for the pot? I'll cut you a price. Otherwise, they're stew by Friday." Sadie walked to the crates. One rabbit, a small gray doe with a torn ear, pressed her nose to the slats and looked up at Sadie with an expression so trusting it undid something in her chest. She counted the crates. She counted the eyes looking back. 64. "How much for all of them?" she heard herself ask. Coyle laughed, then saw she meant it. He named a figure, not large to a wealthy man, but nearly everything Sadie had set aside for summer flour and lamp oil. She stood in the cold mud with the number ringing in her ears, and every sensible voice she possessed rising up to argue. She could not eat 64 rabbits before they bred into 600. She had no extra feed, no proper hutches, no spare hour in a day already worked to the bone. The reasonable thing, the thing her grandmother's practical neighbors would have done, was to buy 2 for the pot, as Coyle suggested, and let the rest go to their fate. That was how the world ran. You took what served you and let the rest be someone else's trouble. But she kept looking at the gray doe with the torn ear. She thought about the long, silent evenings. She thought about the manure she'd read about in a farm paper, how rabbit droppings, unlike most, could go straight onto a garden without burning the roots, rich and cool and full of everything tired soil craved. She thought about the soft fur she'd felt once on a muff in a Chicago shop window, finer than wool, light as breath, warm as a banked fire. She thought about how her beds gave back nothing, and how she had nothing left to lose by trying something the almanacs only whispered about. And underneath all the arithmetic was a simpler thing she could not quite name. The house was so quiet. These were 64 small, warm lives, and they were looking at her, and in 3 days they would be gone from the earth, and she had the power to decide otherwise. "It's foolishness," she said aloud to the wind, to her grandmother, to no one. Coyle shifted impatient. "Foolishness or supper, miss. I got road to make." Sadie thought of her savings tin under the floorboard, the careful coins. She thought of flour and oil and the winter ahead. She thought of going back east. And then she thought of the seed pouch and the words, "Everything alive is giving something. You just have to be patient enough to see it." The carrots were stunted, the cabbages bolted, the soil was dying. Something had to change, and she had run clean out of conventional ideas. "Wait here," she said. She went into the house. She knelt by the floorboard. Her hand shook a little as she lifted the tin, and for a long moment she simply held it, knowing that once she opened it, there would be no quiet, sensible life waiting on the other side. She opened it. She paid him every coin but a small remainder, and Jeb Coyle, shaking his head at the strangeness of women, helped her carry the crates into the barn before he drove off into the dusk, no doubt to tell the story at every stop between here and Ogallala. Then Sadie stood alone in the lantern light with 64 rabbits and a profound understanding of what she had just done. She had spent her flour money on animals she would never eat. She had no hutches, no system, no plan past the conviction in her chest. The doe with the torn ear thumped softly against the crate. "All right," Sadie said, rolling up her sleeves. "All right. We had better make something of each other then." And she got to work. The next morning a boy appeared at her fence. Tobias Pruitt, the neighbor's son, perhaps 11 years old, all elbows and curiosity. He had heard from Coyle, who had stopped at their place for water, that the strange woman had bought the whole wagon load of rabbits. "Are you really keeping all of them?" he asked, awed. "Pa says you'll regret it by June." "Your pa may be right," Sadie said. "Want to help me build hutches?" Tobias was over the fence before she finished the sentence. He became her shadow that spring, her one true friend in a skeptical county, a sharp-eyed, tender-hearted boy who would in time prove to be exactly the witness she needed. They built the hutches from whatever the homestead offered. Sadie tore weathered planks from the sagging side of the barn, and Tobias scavenged wire and nails from the heap behind his father's machine shed, trading his labor for the privilege of naming the rabbits. By the end of the first week, there were a dozen pens raised off the ground on legs, each with a sloped roof to shed rain and a little door latched with a whittled peg. The rabbits, freed from their crowded crates, stretched and groomed and thumped, and seemed to Sadie's eye almost to sigh with relief. She learned them quickly. The gray doe with the torn ear she called Patience, and Patience became the queen of the warren, calm and watchful, the one the others followed. There were bucks the color of wet bark, and does dappled like river stones, and a single white rabbit with eyes like pink glass that Tobias named Ghost and adored above all others. They were not, Sadie discovered, the simple creatures she'd assumed. Each had a temper of its own. Some came to the wire to be scratched between the ears. Some sulked in the corner and judged her. They drummed warnings to one another with their hind feet. They went silent and still when a hawk's shadow crossed the yard. Every one of them frozen as carved stone until the danger passed. Feeding 64 mouths was its own arithmetic. She could not buy grain. Her money was gone. So she turned to the land. She cut wild grasses and clover from the draws where the plow never reached. She saved every carrot top and cabbage leaf and bean vine. She learned which weeds the rabbits relished and which they turned their noses from. Tobias brought dandelions by the apronful, and his little sister, who tagged along despite their father's grumbling, contributed fistfuls of plantain pulled from the roadside. The rabbits ate it all and asked for more, and Sadie's days filled with the green work of gathering. But the thing that changed everything began beneath the hutches. She had built them raised on purpose, remembering the farm paper. And within 2 weeks, the ground below was carpeted with droppings, small, dark, dry pellets that gave off none of the harsh reek of a goat's or a horse's. She gathered the first bucketful and stood over her dying garden beds, hesitant. The almanacs warned that fresh manure burned young plants, killed them in the root. But the paper had been clear. Rabbit was different. Cold, they called it. Gentle enough to use straight from the ground. She worked a careful handful into the soil around a row of struggling carrots and a stand of pale beans, and she marked the row with a stick so she would know it from the others. Then she waited. And waiting, she discovered, was the hardest work of all. Meanwhile, she turned to the fur. As the spring warmed toward summer, the rabbits began to molt, shedding their dense winter coats in soft clouds that caught on the wire. Sadie collected it, working it free with a fine comb she'd bought for her own hair, and she was astonished by what she held. It was not like wool, coarse and oily. It was finer than anything she'd touched. Light as milkweed down, warm against her wrist, soft as a whispered word. She had grown up watching her grandmother spin and knit, and her own fingers remembered. She blended the rabbit fur with a little wool to give it strength, and spun it into a yarn so fine and warm she sat up half the night just running it through her hands. The neighbors, of course, talked. They saw the hutches multiply along her barn wall, and they saw her out at dawn cutting weeds like a pauper, and they drew the conclusions people draw. At the mercantile, Sadie heard the word foolish trail behind her like a hem dragging in the dust. Mrs. Pruitt, kind but baffled, asked her plainly over the fence whether she meant to eat them or just admire them, because she could not for her life see a third option. Horace Bell, the grain dealer who held her note, tipped his hat and observed that animals which produced nothing for the table were a peculiar investment for a woman who owed him money. They produce a great deal, Sadie said. Such as? She thought of the buckets beneath the hutches, the fur drying on her windowsill, the green-gold company of them in the evenings when the wind died and the warren rustled in the dark, and the house was, for the first time, not silent. "You'll see," she told him. She was not, in that moment, entirely sure she believed it herself. But she went home and worked the manure into another row, and she spun another skein, and she waited. June answered her. The marked rows came up first. She saw it on a Thursday morning and called for Tobias so loudly he came running, certain something had died. Instead, she pointed speechless at the carrots. Where the unmarked rows still struggled pale and thin, the rows she had dressed with rabbit manure had erupted. The carrot tops stood lush and feathery and dark green, twice the height of the others. The beans beside them climbed their poles with broad, healthy leaves and set blossoms thick as a quilt stitching. Even the cabbages, which had bolted and failed all her life on this place, formed heads tight and heavy and crisp. Sadie knelt in the dirt and laughed until her eyes stung. The tired soil had not been beyond saving. It had only been hungry, and she had found, in 64 small bodies, exactly what it craved. All that spring she'd been carrying buckets out from under the hutches in faith, and now the faith had a shape, and the shape was food. Real food, more than her quarter-acre had given in the 3 years of records she'd inherited from the family before. She doubled her efforts. She mapped every bed and dressed each one in turn, rotating the bounty beneath the hutches across the whole garden. By July, the plot that had embarrassed her was the envy of any acre in the county, though no one yet would say so aloud. The carrots grew long and sweet. The beans bore until she could not pick them fast enough, and she and Tobias and his sister sat on the porch, snapping them into crocks for putting up. Tomatoes she'd thought hopeless reddened on the vine. Squash sprawled gold and green across ground that the year before had grown nothing but thistle, and the rabbits kept giving. Patience had a litter, and then another doe did, and Sadie, careful, deliberate, let the warren grow only as much as her grass and weeds could feed, trading a few young bucks to a family 2 farms over for a sack of seed potatoes and a length of good wire. She would not sell them for meat. On that she would not bend, and the county found this the most foolish thing of all. A woman sitting on a meat crop in a hard country and refusing to harvest it. But Sadie had made a different bargain with these animals, and she meant to keep it. The fur was the second harvest, and it came in soft drifts all summer. She combed and gathered and spun in the long evenings, building up a store of the fine, warm yarn, blending it with the wool she got in trade. Her grandmother had taught her well, and now she taught herself the rest from a battered pattern book. How to knit gloves with double thickness at the palm, how to work a soft liner that could be sewn into the inside of a coat or a blanket to turn an ordinary covering into something that held heat like a closed hand holds a coal. She made a pair of gloves first, just to see. When they were done, she pulled them on in the July heat, and within a minute had to take them off. They were so warm. She made a second pair for Tobias, who wore them proudly to his chores until his father told him to quit showing off the rabbit woman's nonsense. She made a small blanket lined with the fur and folded it away in her cedar box, and she began slowly to imagine what a North Platte winter would feel like to a body wrapped in such things. The neighbors watched the garden grow and could not deny it. Mrs. Pruitt, swallowing a little pride, asked Sadie what on earth she was feeding her beds, and Sadie told her plainly, and Mrs. Pruitt went home thoughtful. A few others noticed too, but noticing is not the same as understanding, and the gloves and blankets still struck the town as a strange use of an animal God had so obviously made for the pot. Horace Bell, when he came to collect his interest, walked the rows with raised eyebrows and admitted the vegetables were fine. Fine indeed, but a garden, he noted, freezes in October, and a woman still has a note to pay. And what then? Then, said Sadie, you'll see the rest. She had grown bolder by summer's end. She had food in her cellar she had grown herself, coins from the produce she'd sold off the back of a borrowed wagon at the edge of town, and a cedar box filling with the warmest goods she had ever touched. She had a friend in a freckled boy, and a wary respect from at least one neighbor woman. The loneliness that had pressed on her chest in April had been crowded out, bit by green work and small warm lives, and the slow turning of a plan into a fact. She did not know the winter coming would be the hardest in 20 years. In late August, word came down the rail line and along the fences the way weather always does. The old-timers were reading the signs, the thick coats on the horses, the early flocking of the birds, the muskrats building high, and every one of them said the same thing: a bad winter. The worst since the great storms a decade gone, when cattle froze standing and families burned their furniture to keep from freezing too. A flicker of fear went through the county. People began laying in wood and wool and worry, and Sadie Whitcomb, standing among her hutches in the warm dusk with her cedar box full of the warmest goods for 50 miles, felt something she had not felt since stepping off the train. She felt quietly ready. But readiness is not the same as safety, and the months that followed tested her in ways she had not foreseen. The first trouble came from Horace Bell. Sensing the hard winter and wanting his ledgers clean before the roads closed, he sent word in September that Sadie's note had come due in full, not the interest she'd been paying down, but the whole principal, called early on a clause she'd signed in the spring, without the means to argue it. She read the letter 3 times at her kitchen table. The sum was more than she had. It was more than her summer's produce had brought, even sold to the last carrot. If she could not pay by the first hard freeze, the letter said, Mr. Bell would be within his rights to take the homestead in settlement. She walked the rows that evening with her hands cold, despite the lingering warmth. The garden was spent now, the harvest in, the beds resting under their dressing of manure for the spring she suddenly was not sure she would see on this land. She had wagered everything on the rabbits, and the wager had paid in food and fur and friendship, but not yet in the coin that men like Horace Bell understood. The second trouble was the weather, which made good on its threats early. The first blizzard struck in the second week of October, a month ahead of any reasonable winter, and it came with a fury that pinned Sadie in her house for 2 days. When it broke, she fought her way to the barn through drifts to her waist, and found the rabbits huddled and shivering but alive, saved by the very hutches the town had mocked, raised off the frozen ground, packed now with the straw she'd thought to lay in. She wept a little there in the cold barn, from relief and from exhaustion both. Then she carried them, 2 at a time, into the lean-to against the house where she could keep them warmer, and she did not sleep that night for tending them. The cold did not relent. Where most winters gave a week of bitter and then a thaw, this one simply deepened. The town's wood ran low by November. Mrs. Pruitt took a chill that settled in her chest and would not lift. And Sadie heard, with a clench of her heart, that 2 of the older folks in town had taken sick from the cold in their own beds, their houses never warm enough. However, they stoked the stove. And here is where the cruelty of the season turned, slowly, toward an unexpected mercy. Though it did not feel like mercy at the time. Sadie had goods. She had gloves of double-thick rabbit fur and blanket liners, and a few finished coverlets, warm enough to keep a sick child from shivering. She had made them for herself and for the winter she'd foreseen. But she could not keep them folded in a cedar box while a girl coughed in an unwarmed room a half-mile off. She wrapped a fur-lined blanket and a pair of the smallest gloves and fought her way through the snow to the Pruitt place. Mrs. Pruitt met her at the door, gaunt with worry, and Sadie pressed the bundle into her arms without a word about foolishness or rabbits or anything else. They wrapped the girl in it. By morning the child's shivering had eased. By the second day, the worst of the chill had broken. The blanket, lined with the fur of animals the whole county had laughed at, had held heat against the cold like nothing the Pruitts owned. Word of it traveled, as word does. But it traveled tangled up with the harder news, that Horace Bell's deadline stood, that the freeze had come, and Sadie's note was unpaid, that whatever warmth she'd given the Pruitt child, she was herself about to lose the very roof over the lean-to where her rabbits sheltered. The town's sympathy was real but thin. Everyone was cold, everyone was scared. And a woman about to be turned off her place was a sad thing, but not, in such a winter, an unusual one. Sadie counted her coins again by lamplight. She counted what the gloves might bring if she could sell them. It was not enough. The freeze was here, and the note was due. She had an idea, born of desperation and of the one resource she had in abundance. If she could not pay Bell in the coin he wanted, perhaps she could earn it the only way left to her, by selling the warmth she'd made, fast, before the deadline closed like a trap. So in the last week before the freeze deepened to its worst, Sadie loaded her cedar box onto a handsled and dragged it into North Platte. And she set up at the edge of the mercantile porch with her gloves and her liners, and her one spare coverlet laid out on a clean cloth in the brutal cold. At first they only looked. The same faces that had called her foolish all summer eyed her wares and eyed her, and she saw them deciding. Whether buying from the rabbit woman was admitting they'd been wrong. Pride is a stubborn thing, stubborner than cold almost. But the cold won, as cold does. A teamster with cracked, frost-bitten hands tried on a pair of the gloves, and his face changed. He'd worn wool and leather and sheepskin in his life, and never felt anything hold heat like this. He bought them on the spot and told the next man, and the next man told his wife. A mother whose baby would not stop crying from the chill bought a fur-lined liner to sew into the cradle quilt, and came back an hour later to say the child had finally slept. The teamster came back too, wanting a pair for his brother. Sadie sold everything she had brought before midday. The coins were good, better than she dared hope, but as she counted them with numb fingers, she knew with a sinking heart that they were still not enough. The freeze had come early, and Bell had called the whole principal. A single morning's sales, however brisk, could not cover a debt that size. She had perhaps a third of it. She dragged the empty sled home through the blue twilight, with the wind cutting at her, and the math cutting deeper. And she understood that she had proven her rabbit's worth to the entire town, one frozen pair of hands at a time, and that it might not be in time to save her. That was the bitterest part. Not failure through foolishness, but failure on the very edge of being proven right. The orders came anyway. Now that the town had felt the warmth, everyone wanted it. Notes were pressed under her door. The mercantile owner who'd smirked at her in June sent his son to ask whether she might supply goods for him to sell on commission come spring. Mrs. Pruitt organized the women who'd once whispered into a small brigade, offering wool to blend and hands to card and spin if Sadie would teach them, for the demand was plainly more than one woman could ever meet. It was everything Sadie had hoped for in April, and it was arriving, she feared, just slightly too late to matter, because spring orders and winter commissions could not be turned into coin before the freeze, and the freeze was here, and Horace Bell did not take promises. She went to Bell directly the next morning, before the wind had fully risen, walking the 3 miles into North Platte with her cedar box empty and her heart full of a plea she had never imagined she would make. The town was already stirring, men boarding up windows, women counting coal scuttles, children sent to the woodpile with red cheeks and frost-bitten fingers. Everyone was preparing for the worst winter anyone could remember, and everyone was too busy to notice the rabbit woman trudging past with her head held high and her hands clenched inside her coat sleeves. Horace Bell stood behind his counter when she entered, a ledger open in front of him, a pot of coffee steaming on the stove. He looked up and did not seem surprised to see her. Perhaps he had been expecting this visit, or perhaps he had simply been watching the road all morning, knowing what a woman in her position would do when the cold closed in. Sadie laid it all before him, the words coming faster than she intended, spilling out in a rush that she could not slow. She told him about the rabbit manure and the garden, about the fur and the yarn, about the gloves that had sold in a single morning, about the orders piling up faster than she could fill them. She told him she could pay the note, but not by the first freeze. She asked for time, for the principal to be stretched across the winter, for the interest to be paid in goods if he would take them. She asked him to believe that she had found something valuable in those 64 animals, and that the value was only beginning to show itself. Bell listened without interrupting. He tapped his fingers on the ledger. He looked out the window at the gray sky. And then he told her that he would consider it, but that he had other interests pressing, other notes, and that he could promise nothing before the deadline he himself had set, which now stood only 3 days off. 3 days. Sadie left his store with a tight nod and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She walked home in the gathering dusk, the wind rising at her back, and she knew that 3 days might as well have been 3 hours for all the good they would do her. That night, the worst storm of the winter rolled down out of the north. It came without warning, the sky turning a bruised purple at sundown, and then unleashing a fury that made the first blizzard seem like a passing squall. Sadie was in the lean-to, checking on the rabbits, when the wind hit the house with a force that made the walls groan. She ran for the door, made it inside, and spent the next hour stuffing rags into the gaps around the windows and hauling extra straw into the lean-to through the back door, the snow already piling against it so fast she had to push with her shoulder to get it open. The rabbits huddled together, Patience at the center, her calm, dark eyes watching Sadie with an expression that seemed to say, "We have been through worse. We will be through this, too." But Sadie was not sure they would be. The storm raged for 3 days without a pause. The wind howled down the chimney and rattled the stovepipe. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the bucket by the stove developed a skin of ice overnight. She burned wood sparingly, feeding the stove just enough to keep the pipes from freezing, and she spent her waking hours in the lean-to, buried under every blanket she owned, her hands wrapped around the rabbits to share what little warmth she had. They pressed against her, 64 small bodies, and she talked to them in a low voice, telling them about her grandmother's garden back east, about the apple tree that had grown from a seed she had spit into the dirt as a girl, about the way the world kept turning even when it seemed determined to bury you. On the third night, the wind finally died. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a dead silence, a silence that pressed against her ears like wool, and in it she could hear her own heartbeat and the soft breathing of the rabbits and the terrible emptiness of the future. She sat by the stove with her grandmother's seed pouch in her lap, empty now, every seed planted and grown and harvested, and she turned it over in her hands and tried to understand where she had gone wrong. She had not gone wrong. That was the hardest thing to sit with. She had been right about all of it. The soil had only been hungry. The fur was the warmest in the county. The rabbits had given and given exactly as she had believed they would. The whole town had felt it now, on their own frozen hands. She had been right, and being right had not been enough, because the world did not always wait for the patient to be proven so. Sometimes the freeze came early. Sometimes the careful man called the note. Sometimes you did everything right and still lost everything. She thought of going back east. She thought of the train platform, of her grandmother's face in the window. "Everything alive is giving something," the old woman had said. "You just have to be patient enough to see it." But what if you saw it, and the seeing came one storm too late? She looked at the rabbits sleeping in their straw, at Patience, the gray doe with the torn ear, who had looked up at her from a crate in April with such trust. She had saved them. Whatever happened to the land, she had saved 64 lives that would otherwise have been 3 days' meat and forgotten. That, at least, no man could take back. It would have to be enough. She must have fallen asleep in the chair because she woke to light, not the gray light of a winter morning, but a sharp, brilliant light that poured through the window and made her squint. The storm had broken. The sky was a hard, clear blue, and the sun was so bright on the snow that it hurt to look at it. She stood up, stiff and cold, and went to the window. The snow was up to the sill. The road was gone. The barn was a white hump. The fence was invisible. She was buried alive in a world of white. And then she heard the bells, not church bells, sleigh bells, and beneath them voices, and the scrape of shovels. She pressed her face to the cold glass and could not at first make sense of what she saw. Coming up her snow-buried road in a long line were half the families of North Platte. The Pruitts were breaking trail, Tobias at the front with a shovel almost as tall as he was. The teamster with the cracked hands was there, and the mercantile owner's son, and the mother whose baby had finally slept, and a dozen others she recognized, and a dozen she did not. Women with wool baskets, men with shovels, children with red cheeks and determined faces, all of them digging out the road to her gate. And at the front, on a borrowed sled, bundled to the eyes in a coat lined with her own rabbit fur, sat Horace Bell. Sadie opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall, but she did not feel it. She stood in the doorway, watching them come, and she could not move. The line of diggers reached her gate, and Tobias broke through the last drift and stood there, panting, his breath white in the air, his grin so wide it seemed to split his face. "We came," he said. "We all came." Behind him, Horace Bell stepped off the sled and walked up the path they had cleared, his boots crunching in the packed snow. He stopped in front of Sadie and looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I have been sitting in my parlor for 3 days, wrapped in a coat lined with your work, thinking about what kind of man I wish to be remembered as when this hard winter is finally told as a story. And I have concluded that I would rather be remembered as the man who saw what you were building and helped it grow, than the man who tore it down because he was too proud to admit he had been wrong." He held out the paper. "This is a new note. The principal is stretched across 3 years. The payments are to be made in goods, at a fair price agreed upon by both parties, delivered to my store and to the mercantile. It is drawn up and witnessed by Mrs. Pruitt and the teamster, who insisted on being present when I wrote it. I have taken no more interest than is just. And I have added a clause that if you should ever wish to expand your operation, I will extend the credit necessary to do so." Sadie took the paper. Her hands were shaking. She read it through twice, the words blurring in front of her eyes. And when she looked up, the whole town was watching her in silence. "Why?" she asked. It was the only word she could find. Horace Bell shifted his weight, uncomfortable as a man can only be when caught in an act of decency. He tugged at the collar of his coat, the coat lined with her rabbit fur, the coat that had kept him warm through 3 days of blizzard while he wrestled with his conscience. "Because, Miss Whitcomb," he said, "it appears I have been kept alive this winter by 64 animals I declared worthless in your own front yard. A man ought to settle his debts. I find I owe more than money." And then the town came forward. Mrs. Pruitt took Sadie's hands in her own, her fingers rough from work, her eyes bright with tears. "We owe you an apology," she said. "Every one of us who laughed, every one of us who called you foolish. We saw what you were doing, and we did not understand it, and instead of asking, we mocked. But we have felt the warmth of your work now, on our own hands, on our own children's cheeks, and we know what we owe you. So we have come to pay it, not in words but in work. Teach us. Let us help you meet those orders. No child in this county ought to be cold again, and you have shown us how." The women behind her nodded. The men hefted their shovels. The children pressed forward, wanting to see the rabbits, wanting to tell Sadie that their families had warm gloves now, that they had slept warm for the first time all winter. Tobias pushed through the crowd and threw his arms around her waist, and she held him, and she could not speak because her throat was too full. The sun climbed higher, and the snow glittered, and the rabbits stirred in their lean-to, and Sadie Whitcomb stood on her own land, surrounded for the first time not by silence, but by neighbors, by witnesses, by friends. Patience, the gray doe with the torn ear, watched it all from the doorway of the lean-to with her calm, dark eyes, as though she had known how it would go all along. The days that followed the town's visit passed in a blur of work and warmth that Sadie had not allowed herself to imagine. The women came every morning, stamping snow from their boots at her door, their arms full of wool to blend, and questions about carding and spinning. Mrs. Pruitt arrived with her 2 oldest daughters and a determined set to her jaw that said she intended to learn this craft if it took her the rest of the winter. The mercantile owner's son delivered a list of orders so long it made Sadie's head swim. 17 pairs of gloves, 12 blanket liners, 21 scarves, and a special request from the doctor for a fur-lined cap to wear on his night calls. The teamster came back with a second order and a story about a neighbor who had tried to buy gloves from a traveling peddler and found them half as warm for twice the price. Sadie taught them everything she knew. She showed them how to comb the molted fur from the rabbits without startling them, how to blend it with wool in the right proportions, 1 part rabbit to 3 parts wool for strength, or half and half, for a fabric so soft it felt like holding a cloud. She showed them how to spin it on the wheel her grandmother had sent west on the train, the old wheel that had come all the way from Pennsylvania and now sat in the corner of her lean-to, humming through the short winter afternoons. She showed them how to knit the double thickness at the palm, how to sew the liners into coats and blankets so they would not shift, how to finish the edges so they would not fray. And as she taught, she watched the women's faces change, from skepticism to concentration to wonder, and she knew that the rabbits were giving something far beyond fur. They were giving the town a way to survive, but the winter was not finished with them yet. The second storm came in the second week of December, and it made the first blizzard look like a tantrum. It began with a stillness so absolute that Sadie noticed it before she understood what it meant. The wind dropped to nothing. The smoke from her chimney rose straight up and hung in the air like a question mark. The rabbits went quiet, huddling together in the lean-to, with their ears flat against their backs. She had learned to read their silences, and this one told her everything she needed to know. She spent the afternoon hauling extra straw into the lean-to, stacking it high against the walls, banking it around the hutches until each pen was a nest of warmth. She brought in every scrap of firewood she could find, even the split rails from the fence line she had been meaning to mend. She filled every bucket and pot with water from the well, knowing that if the pump froze, she would not have another chance until the thaw. And then the wind came. It arrived not as a gust, but as a sustained roar, like a train passing inches from her ear and never fading. The house groaned. The windows rattled in their frames. Snow began to pile against the glass, and within an hour it had covered the lower panes entirely. The light dimmed to a strange blue twilight, and then to darkness, and Sadie sat by the stove with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and listened to the wind scream. She checked the rabbits every 2 hours through the night, wrapping herself in every layer she owned and pushing through the lean-to door with a lantern that flickered in the draft. They were alive, cold, but alive. Patience had burrowed deep into the straw with her litter, and the others had followed her example, forming a single warm mass of fur and trust. Sadie added more straw, checked the water, and went back to the house. The storm raged for 4 days. On the second day, her wood supply ran low. She began burning the rails she had brought in, feeding them into the stove piece by piece, watching the flames consume the fence that had separated her garden from the prairie. It did not matter. Nothing mattered but staying alive. On the third day, the temperature inside the house dropped so low that she could see her breath even 2 feet from the stove. She moved her mattress into the lean-to, laid it among the hutches, and slept with the rabbits pressed against her on all sides, their small bodies radiating a steady, gentle heat that no fire could match. On the fourth day, the wind stopped. The silence was deafening. Sadie crawled out of the lean-to and forced the front door open against a wall of snow that came up to her chest. She dug her way out, gasping in the cold air, and stood on top of the drift that had buried her house. The world was white and blue and blinding. The barn was a lump. The road was gone. The fence she had burned was no longer visible, and she realized with a distant kind of horror that she had burned the last of her fuel in the storm. She had food, she had water, she had rabbits, but she had no wood and no coal, and no way to heat the house through the weeks that remained before spring. She was not the only one. When the roads were finally broken open 3 days later, the news that came in from the surrounding farms was grim. The Pruitts had burned their chicken coop for firewood. The family to the east had lost 2 cows to the cold. The doctor's horse had frozen in its stall, and he had walked 6 miles through the drifts to reach a patient, arriving with frostbite in both feet. The mercantile had run out of coal, and the grain dealer's store of wood was down to the last stack. The whole county was burning anything that would catch flame, and still the cold pressed in, relentless, as though the winter had decided to take everything they had. Sadie walked into North Platte the afternoon the road reopened, pulling her hand sled behind her. The cedar box on top was full, not with goods to sell this time, but with the last of her fur-lined blankets, her warmest gloves, the spare coverlet she had been saving for herself. She did not know what she would find in town, but she knew that the rabbits had given her more than she could ever repay, and that the only way to honor that gift was to give it away. She found the town in a state of quiet desperation. The mercantile was cold, the stove unlit, the shelves picked clean. The doctor's wife met her at the door of their house, with a face gray from exhaustion and a baby wrapped in a thin quilt. The doctor was out again, she said, and the baby would not stop crying. Sadie opened her cedar box and pulled out the spare coverlet, the one she had made for herself, the one lined with the finest rabbit fur she had ever spun. She wrapped it around the baby, and within 10 minutes the crying stopped and the mother wept. From there, Sadie went from house to house, distributing her goods as she found need. A pair of gloves for the teamster's brother, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite the week before. A fur-lined liner for the widow who lived alone at the edge of town and had burned her last chair. A blanket for the Pruitt girl, whose cough had returned in the second storm. She did not ask for payment. She did not count the cost. She simply gave, and as she gave, she watched the town's eyes change, the hard set of survival softening into something like wonder. Horace Bell was the last stop. She found him in his store, sitting by a cold stove, wrapped in the coat she had lined for him, his ledger open on the counter, but his eyes fixed on nothing. He looked up when she came in, and she saw that he had aged a decade in a month. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "I have burned my own fence to stay warm. I have nothing left to burn but this building, and if I do that, I have nothing left to sell. I believe I understand now what you meant when you said those rabbits were giving something." Sadie set down her cedar box. It was nearly empty now, just a single pair of gloves at the bottom, the first pair she had ever made, the one she had tried on in July and found too warm. She held them out to him. "I kept these," she said. "I do not know why, exactly. Perhaps because they reminded me that I had been right, even when no one believed me. "But I think I kept them for you, Mr. Bell. You have been cold long enough." He took the gloves. He pulled them on, slowly, as if he were afraid they would disappear. And when they were on, he closed his eyes and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "I have been a fool," he said quietly, "and I have been proud. And I have been kept alive this winter by the work of a woman I called foolish to her face. I do not know how to repay that." "You repay it by staying alive," Sadie said, "and by helping your neighbors do the same. That is what the rabbits taught me. Everything alive is giving something. You just have to be patient enough to see it." She left him standing by the cold stove with his hands wrapped in her fur-lined gloves, and she walked home through the snow in the gathering dusk, her cedar box empty, her heart full. The winter was not over. The cold would return. But the town had felt the warmth of what she had built, and they would not forget. She reached her gate as the stars began to appear, hard and bright in the clear sky. The lean-to was glowing with lantern light, and she could hear the soft thump of rabbit feet inside. She stood for a moment in the snow, looking at the small structure that held 64 warm lives, and she understood that she had not saved them after all. They had saved her. The wind picked up again as she opened the door, but she did not flinch. Let it come. She was ready. Sadie woke the next morning to a world that had not warmed. The cold was a living thing, pressed against every wall, seeping through the floorboards, curling around the edges of the windows where the rags she had stuffed were already frozen stiff. The rabbits were quiet in the lean-to, a silence that told her they were conserving their strength. She had learned to read their moods, and the mood this morning was one of deep, patient endurance. They would wait out the cold, but they needed her to help them. She rebuilt the fire with the last of the fence rails, feeling a pang as the wood crackled and turned to ash. She had burned her own boundaries to stay warm, and there was something fitting in that, something she could not quite name. The boundaries had kept people out, but they had also kept her in. Now the boundaries were gone, and the town had come to her. She was not sure she had ever been so tired, or so full. The women arrived at sunup, stamping their feet on her porch, their cheeks red from the cold. Mrs. Pruitt led them, carrying a basket of wool that had been carded and ready for blending. Behind her came the doctor's wife, and the mother whose baby had slept, and 3 other women Sadie recognized from the mercantile. They had come to learn, and they had come to work, and they had come to sit in the warmth of her lean-to and listen to the thump of rabbit feet while they spun yarn that would keep the county alive. Sadie set them to work. She showed them how to comb the molted fur from the rabbits, working the fine fiber loose with gentle fingers, gathering it into soft piles that looked like clouds. She showed them how to blend it with wool on the carding paddles, how to draw it out into rovings that would spin smooth and even. She let each woman sit at the spinning wheel and feel the rhythm of it, the way the fiber twisted into thread under the guidance of a steady hand. The women learned quickly, their fingers remembering what their eyes had never seen, and within a week they were producing yarn almost as fine as Sadie's own. The lean-to became a workshop. The rabbits grew accustomed to the visitors, peering out from their straw nests with bright eyes, occasionally thumping a warning when a new voice startled them. Patience, the gray doe, became a favorite. She would press her nose to the wire and let the women scratch her ears, and Tobias's little sister declared that Patience was the smartest rabbit in the world. Sadie did not argue. Patience had taught her more about patience than any book or almanac ever could. But the winter was long, and the supplies were finite. By the 3rd week of December, the wild grasses and clover that Sadie had cut and dried in the fall were nearly gone. The rabbits were eating through their stores faster than she had anticipated, and she could not gather more. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe. She rationed the feed carefully, mixing it with straw and hay that the Pruitts had brought from their barn. But she knew that if the winter stretched into February, she would run out. And then what? She could not let the rabbits starve. She had saved them from the butcher, and she would not be the one to fail them now. She began to experiment. She remembered from her grandmother's letters that rabbits would eat certain tree barks in winter, the inner cambium layer that held moisture and nutrients. She cut branches from the cottonwoods along the frozen creek, stripped the bark, and offered it to the rabbits. They ate it eagerly, their teeth working the fibrous strips, and she watched their bellies fill with relief. She cut willow branches next, and then the tender tips of the sumac that grew along the fence row. The rabbits ate everything she gave them, and they thrived. The knowledge spread. Tobias went home and brought back branches from the Pruitt's land, and Mrs. Pruitt sent word to the other farms. Soon the women were arriving not only with wool, but with armloads of twigs and bark, and the rabbits ate it all, turning the harsh winter forage into warmth and fur and the steady pulse of life. The lean-to smelled of willow and hay and rabbit, and it was the warmest place in the county, not because of the stove, but because of the bodies. The 64 bodies that had grown to 72 with the winter litters, each one a small furnace of fur and breath. The town began to change. It happened slowly, the way ice melts from the edges of a pond. The hard lines of suspicion and mockery softened. The whispers that had followed Sadie through the mercantile faded into silence, replaced by nods and greetings. The women who came to her lean-to carried the warmth of her work back to their homes, and the warmth spread, house to house, until the whole county seemed to breathe a little easier. Even Horace Bell began to appear differently. He came to the lean-to one afternoon in early January, not to collect a payment, but to bring a sack of grain he had found at the back of his store, left over from the fall and forgotten. "I thought your rabbits might need it," he said, setting it down by the door. He did not linger. He did not ask for anything in return. He simply nodded and left, and Sadie watched him go with a feeling she could not name. The work continued. The orders filled slowly, the women's hands growing faster and surer with each passing day. The mercantile shelves began to stock the rabbit fur goods, and they sold almost as fast as they could be made. The doctor ordered 6 pairs of gloves for the patients he visited in the outlying farms. The teamster ordered a fur-lined vest for himself and a blanket for his mother. The schoolteacher, who had been absent from town for weeks, returned with a pair of mittens she had bought from Sadie's sled, and she told everyone who would listen that she had not been cold a single day since she put them on. But the winter was not done. The third storm came in the second week of January, and it was the worst of them all. It began without warning, the sky turning a bruised purple at midday, the temperature dropping so fast that Sadie felt it in her bones. She had been in the lean-to, spinning, when the wind hit. It slammed into the structure like a fist, rattling the boards, and she felt the whole building shudder. The rabbits went still, every one of them frozen, their ears flat, their eyes wide. Patience pressed her body against the wire, looking at Sadie with an expression that was not fear but something else, a question. "What do we do now?" Sadie did not hesitate. She began moving the hutches, one by one, into the house. She had never done this before. The house was small, barely large enough for her own needs, but she would not leave them to the mercy of the wind. She carried the hutches through the back door, setting them along the walls of the kitchen and the bedroom, stacking them where she could, making room. The rabbits did not resist. They seemed to understand that she was moving them to safety, and they sat quietly in their pens as she lifted them, their small bodies warm and trusting. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the wind howling around her, the snow piling against the windows. By the time the last hutch was inside, she was exhausted, her arms aching, her breath coming in short gasps. She stood in the middle of her kitchen, surrounded by 72 rabbits, and she laughed. It was a strange, wild laugh, half relief and half disbelief. Her house was a warren. Her bed was surrounded by hutches. The stove cast a warm glow over the furry faces that peered out at her from every corner, and the sound of their breathing filled the space that had once been so silent. She made a cup of tea and sat down on the floor, her back against the stove, and Patience pressed her nose to the wire of her hutch and looked at her with those calm, dark eyes. "We made it," Sadie said. "We made it together." But the storm had not finished. It raged through the night, and into the next day, and into the day after that. The snow piled so high that it covered the windows completely, plunging the house into a strange, perpetual twilight. The temperature inside dropped despite the stove, and Sadie burned the last of her wood, and then burned the chair she had been sitting in, and then burned the old crate that had held her grandmother's spinning wheel. She fed the fire with pieces of her own life, piece by piece, and she did not regret a single one. By the third night, the wood was gone. The fire went out. The cold crept in, silent and patient, and Sadie wrapped herself in the last of her blankets and lay down among the hutches, pressing her body against the wire, feeling the warmth of the rabbits on her skin. They huddled close, their small bodies a living blanket, and she closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the seed pouch, empty now, its seeds planted and harvested and become food and warmth, and the beginning of something she had not known she was building. She thought of the train platform, the old woman's hand pressing the pouch into hers, and she heard the voice again. Everything alive is giving something. You just have to be patient enough to see it. She had seen it. She had seen it in the droppings that fed the soil, in the fur that clothed the county, in the trust of a gray doe with a torn ear. She had seen it in the faces of the women who came to her lean-to, in the trembling hands of Horace Bell as he pulled on her gloves, in the quiet strength of a boy who had believed in her when no one else did. She had seen it. And even if the winter took her, she had seen it. That was enough. The wind howled, the snow piled higher, and Sadie Whitcomb, surrounded by 72 small warm lives, closed her eyes and slept. She did not feel the cold. She was woken by light, not the gray twilight of a buried house, but real light, sharp and golden, pouring through a gap that had not been there before. The door. Someone had opened the door. She tried to sit up and found that she could not move easily, because the rabbits had pressed so close to her during the night that she was nearly covered in fur. Patience was curled against her chest, her small body rising and falling with steady breath, and the gray doe looked up at her with those calm, dark eyes and seemed to say, "You are still here. We kept you warm." Sadie heard voices. Tobias first, high and urgent, calling her name. Then Mrs. Pruitt, her voice cracking with relief. Then the scrape of shovels and the thud of boots on the floor. She tried to call out, but her throat was dry and her voice came out as a whisper. It was enough. Tobias heard her and pushed through the crowd of rabbits and hutches and fell to his knees beside her, his face wet with tears she had never seen him cry before. "She's alive!" he shouted over his shoulder. "She's alive! The rabbits kept her warm!" The doctor pushed through next, his fur-lined gloves still on his hands, and he knelt and took her wrist and felt for a pulse. He found it, strong and steady, and he let out a breath that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs. "You stubborn woman," he said, but he was smiling. "You stubborn, wonderful woman. You slept through the coldest night of the century surrounded by rabbits, and you are perfectly fine." Sadie tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "They gave me their warmth," she whispered. "Everything alive is giving something." The doctor helped her sit up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and the women cleared a path to the stove. Someone had brought coal, real coal, from the mercantile's last store, and within minutes a fire was crackling, and the lean-to that had become a house, that had become a warren, was warm again. The rabbits stirred, stretching, thumping, blinking in the sudden light. They had survived, every one of them. 72 small, warm lives, and not a single one lost. News of what had happened spread through the county faster than any storm. The woman who had been mocked for buying 64 rabbits had slept through the worst blizzard in living memory wrapped in their fur, and she had not frozen. She had not even taken a chill. She had lain down among them, and they had kept her alive, and that was a story that no one could laugh at. That was a story that demanded to be told. The town came to her that afternoon, not to dig her out, that was already done, but to see her, to touch her hand, to tell her what she had meant to them. The teamster came and pressed a silver coin into her palm, saying it was for the gloves, the first pair he had bought, because he was not sure he would have his hands without them. The mother whose baby had slept came with a jar of preserves, the last one she had put up in the fall, and she made Sadie promise to eat it. The school teacher came with a letter she had written, telling her students about the rabbit woman of North Platte, and she read it aloud while the women cried and the men cleared their throats and looked away. But it was Horace Bell who came last. He arrived at dusk, when the light was long and blue and the snow had begun to freeze into a hard crust that crunched under his boots. He came alone, without his sled, without his ledger. He stood at Sadie's gate, the gate that had no fence now, because she had burned the rails, and he waited until she came to the door. He looked different. The coat lined with her rabbit fur was gone, replaced by an old wool jacket that was thin and worn. He was shivering. He had walked the 3 miles from town, and he had not dressed for the cold. He stood in front of her, and he did not speak for a long moment. Then he took off his hat, an old battered thing that she had never seen him wear before, and he held it in his hands and looked at the ground. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I have come to say something that I should have said the first time I saw your garden. I have come to say that I was wrong." He looked up and his eyes were red. "I called you foolish. I called your rabbits a waste. I told you that animals which produced nothing for the table were a peculiar investment for a woman who owed me money. And I sat in my house, wrapped in the coat you lined with fur from those same rabbits, and I burned my own furniture to stay alive while you slept among them and came out whole. I do not understand how you did it. I do not understand how you saw what no one else could see. But I understand that I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I will spend the rest of my life telling anyone who will listen that the woman with the rabbits saved this county from the hardest winter we have ever known." Sadie looked at him standing there in the cold, shivering, his pride stripped away like the bark from the willow branches she had fed her rabbits. She remembered the day he had come to collect his interest and tipped his hat, as though the gesture itself were a payment due. She remembered the letter calling her note due in full, the deadline that had seemed like a trap closing around her. She remembered the 3 days of blizzard that had buried her while he sat in his parlor wrestling with his conscience, and she felt nothing but pity. "Mr. Bell," she said, "you are cold, come inside." He hesitated. He looked at her as if he had not expected kindness, as if he had come prepared for anger and did not know what to do with mercy. But she held the door open, and he stepped inside. The lean-to was warm. The fire crackled, and the rabbits stirred in their hutches, and the women who had stayed to help looked up and nodded at him as if he belonged there. He sat down by the stove, and Mrs. Pruitt handed him a cup of tea, and for a long time he simply held it, letting the warmth seep into his hands. Sadie sat across from him. She did not speak. She waited. She had learned to wait, and patience had become her language. "I sold the coat," he said finally, his voice low. "I sold it to a man from Ogallala who had heard about the rabbit fur goods and wanted one for himself. I sold it because I had nothing else to sell, and I needed the money to buy coal for the store. And as I watched him walk away with it, I realized that I had sold the very thing that had kept me alive, and that I had done it to keep myself alive. And there was something wrong in that, something I could not untangle." He looked at her. "You did not sell the rabbits. You gave them warmth, and they gave it back. You did not take from them. You built something with them. And I think that is the difference between us. I take, and you build. And I have been a fool not to see it." Sadie reached into the cedar box by her chair. It was empty now except for one thing, a small square of fur-lined fabric, no larger than a handkerchief, that she had cut from the first blanket she had ever made. She had kept it as a reminder, a piece of the beginning. She held it out to him. "Take this," she said. "It is not a coat, but it will keep your hands warm while you walk home." He looked at it, and then at her, and his eyes filled with tears. "I do not deserve it," he said. "Maybe not," Sadie said, "but that is not why I am giving it to you. I am giving it to you because everything alive is giving something, Mr. Bell. Even you. You gave me time, in the end. You gave me a chance, and I want to give you something back." He took the square of fabric and pressed it to his chest. He did not say anything else. He simply sat there, holding it, while the fire crackled and the rabbits thumped and the women spun their yarn. The winter began to break in early February. The days grew longer, the sun higher, and the snow began to melt in earnest, running off the fields in rivulets that carved dark lines through the white. The roads opened, and the trains began to run again, and the first shipment of Sadie's goods went east, gloves and blankets and scarves, all marked with a small embroidered rabbit that Tobias had designed. The orders multiplied. The mercantile could not keep them in stock. A man from Chicago wrote asking whether she could supply a department store with fur-lined gloves for the following winter, And Sadie wrote back that she would need to expand her warren, but that she believed she could meet the demand. The women who had learned to spin and knit in her lean-to formed a cooperative, with Sadie as the head, and they worked through the spring and summer, building a business that would outlast them all. The garden that year was the best it had ever been. The soil, fed through the fall and winter by the rabbits' droppings, gave back in abundance. The carrots were long and sweet, the cabbages tight and heavy, the beans so plentiful that Sadie had to hire Tobias's sister to help pick them. She canned and dried and stored, and when the next winter came, she was ready. They all were. But the moment that stayed with Sadie, the one she would return to in her mind for the rest of her life, came on a warm evening in late September. The work was done for the day. The women had gone home, the rabbits were settling in for the night, and Sadie sat on her porch, a new porch rebuilt by the men of the town, and watched the sun set over the prairie. Patience was in her lap. The gray doe had grown old, her fur touched with white around her muzzle, her torn ear a little more ragged than it had been. But her eyes were still calm, still watchful, still full of that quiet trust that had changed everything. Sadie stroked her fur, soft and warm, and she thought about the woman who had stood in the mud in April, spending her last coins on 64 lives no one else wanted. She thought about the long winter, the storms, the cold, the moments when she had not been sure she would make it. She thought about the town that had mocked her and then come to her door with shovels and wool and apologies. And she thought about her grandmother, her face in the train window, pressing the seed pouch into her hands. "You were right," she said aloud, to the wind, to the sky, to the old woman who was no longer there to hear her. "Everything alive is giving something. You just have to be patient enough to see it." Patience thumped her hind foot once, a soft sound in the evening air, and Sadie smiled. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.